Dawn broke late on the 9th of November 1944, its first thin light slipping through a ceiling of low, wet clouds that hung over the outskirts of a small French village west of Metz. Cold rain dripped from shattered roof tiles and collected in the muddy hollows, where German infantry of the 353rd Infantry Division had spent much of the night reinforcing their defenses. The men were tired, their uniforms soaked, yet they moved with a methodical determination born from weeks of attrition along the Moselle. Cellar doors had been sandbagged, machine gun pits carved behind broken stone walls, and makeshift barricades hammered together from fallen beams, and furniture dragged out of abandoned homes. Patrols returning from the tree line reported engine noise in the woods to the west. American armor massing, perhaps a battalion's worth, but officers reassured their men that the village's layered positions, combined with several camouflage Pak-40 anti-tank guns, could delay whatever assault the morning would bring. As the rain tapered into mist just after sunrise, a strange vibration rolled across the fields, faint at first, then concentrating into an unfamiliar metallic hiss. Veteran soldiers, accustomed to distinguishing the thump of American mortars from the sharper crack of their artillery, exchanged uneasy glances. This sound was neither. It rose like pressure venting from some massive valve, a swelling roar that made the air itself seem to tighten. A lookout near a collapsed barn crouched instinctively, scanning for muzzle flashes or dust plumes. But the western tree line revealed only the dark silhouettes of Sherman tanks edging forward. Their turrets, however, bore something he had never seen: tall racks bristling with cylindrical tubes, clamped above the main gun like the organ pipes of a cathedral twisted for war. The realization came too late. With a sudden unified burst, dozens of rockets tore into the sky, each trailing a stream of gray smoke. They rose in tight formation, hissing through the morning air in a way that made several men duck even before the impacts arrived. A second later, the village vanished beneath a curtain of explosions. The first rocket slammed into a farmhouse that had been converted into a platoon command post, engulfing it in a rolling fireburst that sent shingles and masonry spinning into the street. Others struck trench lines and weapon pits along the forward edge, blasting machine gun teams from their positions before they could even chamber a round. The concussive shock washed through the streets like a physical force, shattering doors, blowing out windows, and collapsing the weakened roofs of homes already damaged by earlier fighting. German infantrymen stumbled through the sudden smoke, disoriented by the scale of destruction. Some had believed the Americans were merely probing. None had imagined that a single tank could unleash a barrage resembling a compact artillery strike. One corporal later described the sensation as a wall of fire falling in a single breath, a salvo so dense it felt impossible to measure where one blast ended and the next began. Survivors regrouped in fragments, coughing through the dust and trying to locate officers who had been separated or buried. Rumors spread with unsettling speed. Talk of a new American siege weapon, a tank capable of launching rockets in mass volleys rather than firing shells one at a time. The appearance of the Sherman Calliope, still unfamiliar to German frontline units in early November, had struck with precisely the shock its designers intended as officers attempted to restore order. The lingering smoke drifted eastward, revealing the scale of the damage and the unsettling truth that their defensive principles had just been upended. The morning's violence marked only the beginning of a broader shift, one that would soon force German commanders to reassess not merely the armor facing them, but the increasingly unpredictable ways Allied firepower could reshape the battlefield. The next section will turn to how these weapons emerged and why their development accelerated during the push toward the German frontier. By the summer of 1944, as American armored divisions pushed beyond the breakout from Normandy and into the interior of France, the nature of the battlefield had shifted in a way that imposed new pressures on U.S. offensive doctrine. Gone were the wide bocage lanes where infantry and tanks had struggled side by side. In their place rose a patchwork of fortified villages, thick-walled farmhouses, and stone outbuildings that had been converted into improvised strongpoints. German units, drawing on years of defensive experience, turned every settlement into a citadel anchored by camouflage pack guns, interlocking machine gun nest, and cellars reinforced to withstand anything short of a full artillery preparation. For American tankers of the 3rd and 4th Armored Divisions, each advance became a sequence of stop and start assaults where momentum evaporated as soon as a hitting gun destroyed the lead Sherman or a stubborn strongpoint pinned down assault troops in the streets. This grinding tempo exposed a deep operational problem. Overwhelming firepower existed, but it was not immediately available. Large artillery barrages could break these defensive nodes, yet they required coordination, time, and substantial ammunition, all of which slowed the advance and risked giving German units the opportunity to reorganize or withdraw. Commanders needed a way to deliver a shock effect at the very start of an assault, something fast, mobile, and devastating enough to collapse a strongpoint before infantry were committed. This requirement revived ideas first proposed in late 1943, when ordnance engineers experimented with mounting for .5-inch barrage rockets atop tank turrets. The hope was to create a weapon system that delivered the saturation fire of a small rocket battery without the logistical footprint of towing or positioning separate launchers. The urgency behind these experiments intensified after the Hedgerow fighting in June and July 1944 revealed how quickly American armor could be trapped in kill zones. Sherman tanks advancing through narrow lanes often emerged into open fields, already zeroed by German anti-tank guns, and losses spiked whenever a well-concealed weapon fired at point-blank range. A standoff capability, something that could disorient defenders before tanks crossed these danger points, offered a way to flip the tactical balance. Out of this need emerged the T34 Calliope, a rack of 60 tubes fixed above the Sherman turret, designed not for precision, but for overwhelming disruption. When fired in mass salvos, these rockets could generate the psychological and physical shock of a concentrated bombardment, delivered instantly and without waiting for artillery assets to reposition. By the time American forces advanced toward the Moselle and Saar regions in the autumn of 1944, the Calliope had evolved from a field experiment into a viable operational asset. It represented a direct response to the hardened German defenses that dominated the Lorraine campaign, a mobile tool meant to shatter resistance in the opening seconds of an assault. The next section will explore how American crews learned to handle this unconventional system and adapt its firepower to the unfolding battles that winter. The T34 Calliope represented a dramatic departure from the familiar silhouette of the American M4 Sherman, transforming a standard medium tank into a mobile platform, capable of unleashing a torrent of rockets in mere seconds. Officially designated the T-30 for multiple rocket launcher, the system mounted 60 tubes above the turret in a stacked configuration of horizontal rows, each containing 4.5-inch M8 rockets. These rockets, weighing around 18 kilograms apiece, carried high explosive warheads designed to fragment violently on impact, sending steel shards through wooden structures, trench covers, sandbag walls, and light field fortifications with lethal efficiency. When a Calliope salvo descended on a target area, the effect was closer to a sudden localized storm than a conventional tank attack. A brief, dense wave of explosions meant to overwhelm rather than pick apart individual positions. The launcher itself was fired electrically from within the turret, allowing crews to deliver all 60 rockets in a full 10-second burst, or release them in partial salvos depending on the tactical need. Its mounting system was one of the design's more unusual features. The entire rocket rack was secured directly to the Sherman's gun mantlet. As a result, the elevation of the rocket tubes mirrored the elevation of the tank's 75mm or 76mm main gun. This linkage simplified integration with the Sherman's existing elevation and traverse mechanisms, but it also created practical complications. The crew had to calculate angles based on the gun rather than the launcher, and slight shifts in terrain could alter the rocket trajectory. Nevertheless, this arrangement provided stability during firing and allowed the tank to adjust its aim, with the same controls used for conventional gunnery. The M8 rockets had an effective range of approximately 1,100 to 4,000 meters, though practical accuracy was best inside 1,800 meters. Their purpose was not pinpoint precision but saturation. When dozens ignited simultaneously, they produced a layered, unearthly shriek as the tubes vented smoke and flame. German troops, accustomed to artillery shells and Nebelwerfer rockets, found the Calliope sound distinct, a multi-toned roar that signaled an incoming wall of explosions, rather than a sequence of individual impacts. Each rocket cut a visible trail through the air, and the combined barrage created a sudden psychological shock that often forced defenders to keep their heads down during the most critical opening seconds of an assault. Reloading. The launcher required the crew to climb onto the tank, handling each rocket by hand, which meant Calliopes generally withdrew to rear positions after firing. Their value lay not in sustained fire, but in delivering one overwhelming blow at the moment, when American infantry and armor were preparing to advance. Despite its bulky appearance and inherent limitations in accuracy, the T-34 system brought a level of mobile firepower previously unavailable to armored spearheads, bridging the gap between artillery preparation and tank assault. Its technical capabilities set the stage for its first major use during the U.S. advance across Lorraine, where hardened German defenses would soon confront a weapon unlike anything they had anticipated. Cold rain swept across the Lorraine countryside in early November 1944, turning the fields around Hürtgen and Düren into a patchwork of sucking mud and broken hedgerows. as American armor columns pushed forward. The weather and the terrain combined with stubborn German resistance to slow their progress to a crawl. Units of the 2nd Armored Division found themselves repeatedly checked by fortified villages, held by elements of the 361st Volksgrenadier Division, whose infantry had dug into cellars, converted barns into firing points, and sighted their anti-tank guns to cover the narrow approaches leading into the settlements. Several assaults stalled under machine gun fire and well-placed mortar strikes, and commanders grew increasingly aware that conventional tactics risked attritional losses they could ill afford. It was amid this tactical deadlock that the newly fielded Sherman Calliope received its first real test under combat conditions. On the morning of the 8th of November, a platoon of Calliope-equipped Shermans moved into concealed positions behind a hedgerow, overlooking a crucial crossroad south of Hürtgen. The location had already resisted multiple attempts by American infantry to advance, and German observers believed they had successfully blunted the day's opening probes. Moments after the Shermans halted, the order to fire was transmitted across the platoon's radios. What followed tore through the damp air, with a sound unlike anything the infantry on either side had heard. 60 rockets erupting from each Calliope in a rising, metallic roar that rolled across the landscape like the opening blast of a sudden storm. American troops reported feeling the concussion through their helmets, as if the shockwave pressed the air out of their lungs. German defenders, initially mistaking the shrieking approach of the M8 rockets for a heavy artillery salvo, looked up expecting to see bursting shells, only to witness clusters of fire descending in tight, terrifying arcs. The barrage struck with devastating effect. Machine gun pits along the crossroads were overturned in seconds, and a fortified barn that housed an anti-tank team collapsed inward, as multiple rockets punched through its upper walls. Cellars that had been converted into strong points filled with choking smoke when their entrances were blasted apart. An ammunition store, struck by the near-simultaneous impacts, detonated in a thunderous flash that sent fragments across the adjacent lane. Panic rippled through the German lines as soldiers scrambled for cover or fled toward the next ridge, convinced that a massive artillery group had targeted them. By the time the main American assault advanced, resistance at the crossroads had already cracked. U.S. infantry secured the position with minimal casualties, noting that most surviving defenders appeared stunned rather than organized. In the following days, commanders began using the Calliope more deliberately. Rockets were fired to collapse lofts where snipers were hiding, to suppress anti-tank guns waiting in the shadows of village alleys, and to shock defenders into abandoning positions before Shermans moved forward. Reports filtered through German channels describing tanks that could unleash battery-level fire by themselves, a capability officers had neither expected nor prepared for. The Calliope's baptism of fire in Lorraine proved that its shock effect could decisively alter the opening seconds of an engagement, a lesson that American commanders would carry into the darker, more confined battles soon to erupt in the forest of the Hürtgen region. Morning frost still clung to the ruined farmsteads of Lorraine when the first German intelligence summaries reached divisional headquarters in mid-November 1944. The initial battlefield reports were frantic, written by officers and NCOs who had watched entire sections of their defensive lines vanish beneath sudden curtains of fire. One message from a forward company of the 361st Volksgrenadier Division spoke of strange rack structures fixed above Sherman turrets, describing them as tiered metal frames that glinted briefly in the rain, before erupting in what appeared to be simultaneous flames. Another observer, shaken by the shockwave of a Calliope salvo, claimed the Americans had developed a mobile Nebelwerfer, a reference to the German six-barreled rocket launcher whose howl had terrified Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front. The comparison was not entirely inaccurate, but the reports conveyed an unmistakable sense of confusion. No one could determine whether these tanks were firing artillery rockets, incendiary weapons, or some new American experimental system designed to collapse fortified cellars. Within days, the scattered accounts grew more dramatic. Infantrymen described storms of fire arriving faster than traditional artillery could be adjusted, leading some to believe that multiple rocket batteries had been concentrated against individual villages. The violence of the impacts amplified this misconception. Dugouts that had endured repeated shelling were ripped open as if by a focused explosive blast, and machine gun crews who believed they were safely positioned behind stout stone walls were thrown aside when rockets punched through roof beams and detonated inside enclosed rooms. Patrol leaders wrote of multi-round flame weapons and claimed that the Americans were testing new incendiary munitions. Luftwaffe liaison officers, reading these frontline dispatches, speculated that the projectiles resembled small air-to-ground rockets fired from attack aircraft. The psychological effect quickly became a central theme of German accounts. In their diaries, Volksgrenadier soldiers referred to the sound of an approaching salvo as thunderpipes, a wailing, multi-layered shriek that built into a roar so unnatural that hardened veterans felt their stomachs twist before the rockets even landed. One sergeant, a survivor of the Eastern Front, wrote that the noise reminded him of screaming demons. Except this time the source was not distant artillery but armored vehicles, only a few hundred meters away, from men already exhausted by constant withdrawals. The idea that no cellar or reinforced dugout could guarantee protection spread unease through the ranks, eroding confidence in the very positions they were ordered to hold. German intelligence officers attempted to make sense of the weapon but faced severe limitations. Because Calliopes usually withdrew immediately after firing and were protected by American armored screens, German units rarely had a chance to overrun or examine a damaged launcher. Analysts ultimately concluded that the system was engineered for saturation fire against fixed defenses, a mobile substitute for artillery meant to blast open the first layer of a fortified village. Yet even this assessment carried significant uncertainty. Commanders struggled to determine whether the Calliope should be prioritized like a tank threat, counter-battery asset, or specialized engineering device. This tactical ambiguity hindered their responses well into December 1944, just as the American advance pressed toward the dense, fog-shrouded Hürtgen forest. There, German defenders would once again confront the rocket tanks, this time in terrain where concealment, sudden eruptions of fire, and psychological shock became even more decisive. The rise of the Sherman Calliope owed as much to American industrial depth as to battlefield innovation. Unlike the Soviet Union, whose Katyusha launchers demanded new truck production lines and large-scale adaptation of existing artillery plants, the United States required no sweeping industrial reorganization to field its rocket tanks. Instead, the T34 Calliope drew on the sprawling manufacturing network already feeding the M4 Sherman program. The launcher itself was produced as a bolt-on kit, a framed assembly of 60 steel tubes, electrical connectors, and firing circuitry designed to fit onto a standard Sherman without altering its engine, turret ring, or interior layout. This modular approach allowed American factories, including those overseen by the General Electric Company, to manufacture launchers alongside existing tank components, with minimal disruption to production schedules. The rockets that armed the Calliope were equally convenient. The 4.5-inch M8 projectile had been developed initially for use by aircraft, but transitioned smoothly into ground applications. Chemical plants across the United States delivered enormous quantities of these high-explosive rounds, millions of them by late 1944, ensuring that armored units in Europe would not face shortages even during periods of intense operational tempo. The key to sustaining the supply lay in logistics. Networks such as the Red Ball Express, reinforced by parallel truck convoys and rail lines pushing east from the Normandy ports, carried pallet after pallet of M8 rockets toward the front. Ordnance units established specialized rocket distribution points near armored division assembly areas, where Calliope crews could resupply before upcoming assaults. Reloading the launcher remained labor-intensive. Crews had to climb up the turret, remove spent casings, and insert each new rocket by hand, a task that took time and demanded relative safety. To support this requirement, maintenance teams strengthened mounting brackets, replaced stressed wiring after repeated salvos, and ensured the launcher frames remained rigid under repeated recoil forces. Logistics officers learned to cycle Calliope-equipped Shermans through forward-firing positions and rear rearming zones much like self-propelled artillery pieces. Despite the system's expanding availability, commanders used it sparingly, equipping only a fraction of their Shermans with launchers to preserve resources, while maximizing shock potential. By late 1944, this industrial and logistical ecosystem proved remarkably resilient, even as the front moved rapidly across eastern France. American armored divisions received rockets in dependable quantities, allowing Calliopes to support consecutive operations with little interruption. This reliability ensured the weapon would be present for the upcoming battles that demanded sudden, overwhelming firepower. The grinding, fog-shrouded struggles in the Hürtgen forest and the rapidly shifting engagements of the Ardennes offensive. There, the strength of the American production base would translate directly into shock, saturation, and battlefield disruption. In the closing months of 1944, the Hürtgen forest stood as one of the most punishing battlegrounds encountered by American forces. A labyrinth of dense evergreen stands, steep ridges, and fortified German positions dug into the earth with months of preparation. Fog clung low to the forest floor, muffling sound and obscuring movement, while the canopy overhead turned daylight into a dim green twilight. For artillerymen, the forest posed a crippling problem. Rounds meant to smash bunkers often detonated prematurely against branches, scattering shrapnel harmlessly above the enemy. Infantry attacks were swallowed by the woods, their lines broken and redirected by unseen ravines and camouflage trenches. Against this backdrop of stalled advances and rising casualties, the U.S. Army sought a weapon that could strike directly at the forest floor, and the Sherman Calliope offered an answer. On the 21st of November 1944, near the village of Grishow, American commanders selected a hardened German strongpoint for the Calliope's first major employment inside the forest. The position consisted of interlocking trenches, machine gun nest, and log-covered shelters arranged across a narrow plateau overlooking the American approach routes. Traditional artillery had failed to dislodge the defenders. Fragments caught in tree trunks, and the bunkers held firm under the blast. Shortly after midday, a group of Calliope-equipped Shermans crept forward until they found a gap in the trees, broad enough for firing. When the order came, the tanks unleashed their rockets in a series of rapid salvos that fractured the forest. Oppressive stillness. The effect was transformative. M8 rockets punched through the undergrowth and slammed into the ground-level bunkers with burst that tore through timber, earth, and ammunition stores hidden beneath the shelters. German accounts described lethal fragmentation spraying both horizontally and upward, as rockets detonated between tree trunks, sending splinters of wood and metal ricocheting across the defensive lines. The interlocking trenches that had once formed a resilient perimeter became exposed kill zones, as smoke and falling debris forced soldiers into the open. Several defenders later reported that the combination of ground-level explosions and fragments slicing through the forest created zones of death from which escape was nearly impossible. As American infantry advanced behind the barrage, they found the strong point hollowed out, its defenders shaken or withdrawing in disarray. The capture of the position at Grishow reinforced the growing belief that the Calliope offered a rare means of overcoming the forest-entrenched defenses. In the days that followed, similar rocket strikes were used to clear crossroads, shatter assembly areas for counterattacks, and blast open narrow fire breaks through which infantry and armor could advance. Although aiming remained difficult under the forest canopy, the sheer saturation power of the Calliope compensated for any loss of precision. German morale suffered noticeably as soldiers realized that the thick woods, once their strongest protection, could be transformed into a blazing, splintered barrier whenever rocket tanks were nearby. The weapon's success in Hürtgen marked a turning point in American confidence. As winter deepened and rumors of a German counteroffensive spread, commanders prepared to use the Calliope again, this time in the snow-covered valleys and villages of Belgium, where its shock effect would meet an enemy launching its final major offensive of the war. Winter descended brutally over the Ardennes in December 1944, cloaking the hills and forested valleys in deep snow just as the German counteroffensive erupted. Across the American lines, whiteout conditions, frozen roads, and jammed crossroads turned each retreat counterattack, or repositioning into a struggle against both the weather and the enemy's momentum. Artillery units, often mired or forced to redeploy under fire, could not always respond quickly enough to blunt sudden German advances. In this chaos, the Sherman Calliope emerged as a weapon uniquely suited to the moment, a source of immediate, overwhelming firepower that American commanders could unleash, without waiting for batteries to set up or observers to adjust their fire. Near Mannheim, where elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division pressed hard against fragmented American positions, Calliopes rolled into firing points hastily scraped from roadside embankments. Once their tubes elevated, the rocket tanks delivered salvos that tore across the snow-covered clearings, with a violence magnified by the winter stillness. The streaks of flame illuminated the night sky, their shrieking ascent cutting through the howl of the wind. German infantry advancing through the trees suddenly found themselves engulfed in a storm of explosions so rapid and disorienting that survivors later struggled to determine whether they had been hit by artillery, aerial rockets, or some entirely new American contrivance. The bombardments fractured assembly areas, forcing assault groups to scatter and disrupting the timing of attacks that relied on close coordination. At St. Vith, where American units fought desperately to hold a shrinking defensive perimeter, the Calliope's psychological impact proved just as significant as its physical destruction. Frozen and exhausted German soldiers, already operating at the edge of endurance, reported feeling momentarily paralyzed when the first salvos detonated around them. Bursts of flame chewed through tree lines, sending showers of snow and splintered wood across trenches and foxholes. Some German platoons withdrew preemptively, fearing that the rockets signaled the arrival of larger American armored formations. For U.S. infantrymen, the presence of rocket tanks offered a tangible boost to morale. The shriek of outgoing rockets, far from unnerving them, signified that despite the confusion of the offensive, they possessed a weapon capable of turning the tide within seconds. As the initial shock of the German assault faded and the Allies shifted to counterattack, the Calliope continued to shape the battlefield. Rocket-equipped Shermans hammered German fallback positions along forest roads and ridgelines, tearing gaps through hastily dug defenses and forcing rearguards to abandon positions before they could mount organized resistance. These strikes underscored a new reality recognized even by German officers. The Americans now fielded mobile armored vehicles capable of projecting the kind of saturation fire previously associated only with static rocket batteries or specialized artillery units. The psychological and tactical effects of the Calliope in the Ardennes convinced commanders that the weapon would play a vital role in the final push toward the Rhine. Its firepower, mobility, and shock value had proven indispensable during one of the most chaotic battles of the Western Front, a lesson that would shape its continued deployment as the Allies prepared to breach the last major defensive barriers of the Third Reich. By early 1945, as Allied forces approached Germany's western frontier, the Rhine River emerged as both a physical barrier and the last major defensive line, shielding the industrial heart of the Third Reich. The collapse of the Siegfried Line had left German formations disorganized, but their artillery, fortified riverbank positions, and scattered strongpoints still posed serious threats to any attempt at crossing the Rhine. In this critical phase, the Sherman Calliope became a potent enabler of the rapid tempo American commanders sought to maintain. Its mobility allowed frontline units to deliver saturation fire exactly where engineers, infantry, and armor needed it, without the delays inherent in coordinating large-scale artillery bombardments. During the fighting near Remagen in March 1945, days after U.S. forces unexpectedly seized the Ludendorff Bridge, Calliope-equipped Shermans were moved into concealed positions, overlooking the slopes and villages west of the river. German infantry attempting to regroup and establish firing lines found themselves struck by sudden rocket barrages that tore through positions before defensive networks could take shape. Calliopes targeted fortified cellars, machine gun nest, and anti-tank teams whose fire threatened the fragile bridgehead. The salvos disrupted command posts and communications centers that had hastily relocated to farm buildings and church basements, fragmenting the coherence of German counterattack plans. American engineers, racing to reinforce the captured bridge, gained crucial breathing room as rocket fire suppressed enemy artillery observers, struggling to direct fire onto the crossing farther south. During Operation Lumberjack, Calliope supported the sweeping American offensive intended to seize the west bank of the Rhine and isolate German forces opposite Cologne and Koblenz. Rocket tanks fired into riverbank trenches, reducing pockets of resistance before infantry arrived, and hammered wooded ridges where German units attempted to mount delaying actions. The result was a series of rapid advances, towns, and crossroads that might have required prolonged firefights were instead neutralized by short, violent bursts of rocket fire that forced defenders to retreat or risk annihilation. Strategically, the Calliope's performance during the Rhine operations marked a turning point in American armored doctrine. Commanders recognized that mobile saturation fire allowed assaults to begin with minimal warning, stripping German defenders of the predictability they had relied on throughout the war. No longer dependent on lengthy artillery preparations, U.S. forces could strike with greater flexibility, applying rocket barrages whenever an unforeseen defensive knot threatened to slow momentum. For German officers, the realization that American tanks now carried the destructive potential of compact rocket batteries introduced an unsettling new variable into an already collapsing defensive system. As the Allies prepared for the final drive into the Ruhr, the Calliope had established itself as an indispensable tool for accelerating breakthroughs and reducing resistance before American troops even reached the edge of a contested town. Its effectiveness along the Rhine signaled the emergence of armored units capable of delivering high-volume fire support on the move, a concept that would echo into the evolution of post-war rocket artillery and mobile assault tactics. Snowmelt and early spring mud clung to the treads of many Calliope-equipped Shermans as they pushed deeper into western Germany. But by this stage of the campaign, crews understood clearly that the rocket launcher mounted above their turret was both a powerful asset and a significant burden. The T-34 system's greatest flaw lay in its integration with the tank's own gun mantlet, because the launcher frame was bolted directly to the main gun. Elevation was dictated not by the ideal trajectory for the rockets, but by the limitations of the 75mm or 76mm cannon beneath it. Small shifts in terrain could throw off the rocket's flight path, and precise ranging required careful preparation that was not always possible. In fluid battlefield conditions, crews learned to accept that the Calliope's purpose was shock, not accuracy, and that compensating for its mechanical constraints demanded skill and patience. The smoke generated by firing posed an equally serious problem. A full Calliope salvo poured columns of flame and exhaust skyward, leaving behind a thick, hanging cloud that revealed the tank's location to any German observer with binoculars. If a Calliope remained in position after firing, it risked counterattack from artillery, mortars, or prowling anti-tank teams. This vulnerability forced American commanders to adopt hit-and-move tactics. Calliopes fired from concealed ridgelines or behind embankments, then immediately reversed into tree lines or side roads before German fire could lock onto them. In close combat situations, the launcher created additional frustrations. Its bulk restricted the Sherman's main gun from elevating freely, and in urban fighting the overhanging tubes could snag on debris, or limit turret traverse at critical moments. For many crews, the Calliope transformed their tank from a flexible combat vehicle into a specialized tool. With sharply defined uses, reloading also remained a laborious chore. After each mission, crews had to climb onto the launcher frame, remove spent tubes or residue, and insert 60 new rockets by hand. Performing this task under fire was nearly impossible, and even in rear areas it consumed valuable time. As rocket supplies dwindled late in the war, some crews chose to remove the launcher entirely, restoring the tank's full mobility and returning it to its traditional role in assault or support operations. Others made field modifications to stabilize the frame, reinforce wiring, or reduce the launcher's shake during travel. Though these improvements were uneven and improvised, American engineers explored upgraded designs, heavier rockets, sturdier mounting racks, and systems that would not interfere with the main gun. But the war ended before these refinements could be tested widely. The Calliope, for all its power, ultimately remained a system defined as much by its limitations as by its explosive capability. Yet those limitations did not diminish the lessons it taught. When employed as a shock weapon to clear strongpoints, disorganize defenders, or cover the opening moments of an assault, it proved invaluable. Commanders learned to integrate saturation fire into armored doctrine in ways that anticipated the multi-launch rocket systems of the post-war era. As the Allies closed in on Germany's industrial heartland in 1945, the Calliope's mixed legacy became clear: flawed yet formidable, cumbersome yet capable of turning the tide when used with discipline and precision. It was a battlefield experiment that left a lasting imprint on armored warfare, shaping the evolution of rocket-assisted firepower long after its tubes fell silent. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the Sherman Calliope quickly disappeared from frontline inventories. Yet its influence lingered long after the last launcher frame was unbolted from an M4 turret. To many post-war analysts, the Calliope was less a perfected weapon and more an audacious field experiment, a demonstration that mobile armored platforms could carry not only guns, but entire barrages of indirect fire rockets. Though its own combat career had been brief, the concept it embodied proved far more durable. American planners entering the early Cold War recognized that the Calliope's real significance lay in the marriage of mobility, armor protection, and saturation fire. Even as the U.S. Army shifted toward more advanced artillery systems, the core idea that rockets could be delivered from a protected, mobile vehicle became a doctrinal cornerstone. The first echoes of this influence appeared in programs like the M16 rocket system and the expanding lineage of armored rocket carriers tested in the late 1940s and early 1950s. These projects explored heavier warheads, stable firing platforms, and improved fire control systems, all concepts the Calliope had hinted at but could not fully realize. By the time the M270 multiple launch rocket system emerged decades later, the intellectual lineage was unmistakable: high-volume fire delivered from a protected vehicle, capable of supporting rapid, deep operations. Military theorists studying the Calliope's wartime performance noted that its psychological and tactical shock effects had often exceeded its raw destructive power. German defenders had been rattled not simply because the rockets caused damage, but because they arrived suddenly in overwhelming numbers, and from armored vehicles previously associated only with direct fire. Allied nations examining captured launchers and battlefield reports reached similar conclusions. The Calliope had proven the feasibility of placing rocket artillery much closer to the front line than traditional towed batteries could safely operate. Its armored chassis allowed rocket systems to survive counterfire, reposition quickly, and respond to changing battlefield conditions in minutes rather than hours. Although the T-34 design itself became obsolete as more sophisticated submunitions, guided rockets, and stabilized platforms emerged, its conceptual DNA remained deeply embedded in Western artillery thinking. Historically, the Calliope has often been overshadowed by the more iconic machines of the Second World War: the Tiger, the Sherman, the Katyusha. Yet its contribution to breaking fortified resistance during the final Allied drive into Germany was tangible, and its legacy as a technological bridge is increasingly recognized by historians. It demonstrated that armored formations could carry not only guns, but entire waves of explosive firepower, delivered instantly at the decisive moment of an assault. In the transformation of post-war armored doctrine, the Calliope stands as a testament to how battlefield improvisation can shape military innovation long after the machines themselves have vanished from service. Spring arrived unevenly across the battlefields of Western Germany in 1945, melting snowdrifts into muddy streams that slid along the edges of ruined towns and scorched hedgerows. By then, the Sherman Calliope had become a familiar yet still unsettling presence within American armored columns, a weapon that defied expectations every time its rockets screamed into the sky. To German troops, who had long learned to read the movements of American armor, the Calliope upended every assumption. Tanks that once signaled a predictable pattern of fire and maneuver now carry the ability to unleash barrages resembling compact rocket batteries, turning secure defensive pockets into smoldering wreckage before a single infantry squad advanced. The shock that first rippled through German lines in Lorraine in November 1944 echoed again in the Hürtgen forest, where the rockets tore through timber bunkers that had resisted weeks of shelling, and in the Ardennes, where salvos lit frozen valleys with streaks of flame that forced advancing troops into panicked retreat. The Calliope was never meant to replace artillery, and it never did. Its value lay in its power to collapse resistance within seconds, to fracture morale, and to give American units the momentum they needed in some of the worst terrain and weather of the European campaign. Broken strongpoints, disrupted counterattacks, and the rapid seizure of key crossroads all testified to the weapon's role in shaping the pace of late-war operations. As American divisions crossed the Rhine and drove deeper into Germany, the Calliope stood as a testament to Allied adaptability, a reminder that battlefield innovation did not cease simply because the war was entering its final months. And when we returned to that rainy morning near Metz, to the German soldiers who watched their fortified village vanish beneath a storm of descending rockets, the weapon's significance becomes unmistakable. The Calliope marked the arrival of a new era in armored warfare, one defined by the fusion of mobility and overwhelming firepower. Its legacy endures in the story of 1944-45 as proof that sudden, concentrated destruction can shatter not just defensive lines, but the certainty of those who believed they knew the limits of their enemy's capabilities.